everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined by WPR associate editors Elliot Waldman. Hi, Elliot.
Hey, Judah.
And Prachi Vidwans. Hi, Prachi.
Hi, Judah.
We'll be talking about this week's deal between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz to form an emergency government, as well as the broader implications of the coronavirus pandemic for electoral democracies around the world. Before we get started, just a quick reminder for everyone listening that the interview episode of the podcast went live Wednesday. Elliot spoke with Daniel McDowell about what governments and central banks have done right so far in managing the economic fallout from the coronavirus pandemic and what more needs to be done moving forward. Elliot, Prachi, we saw this week after three elections in less than a year in Israel, all of them indecisive and relatively consistent with minor movement in terms of the actual electoral outcomes. We saw this emergency government deal emerge between Netanyahu and Gantz. That more than anything, Elliot, and you've interviewed Michael Koplow in advance of those elections, and we've run some coverage of it of the previous outcomes. It seems like more than anything that Gantz essentially gave into this deal to avoid new elections.
Sure, it does seem like that, although I would say that the prospect of new elections has not been completely avoided yet. I mean, there's an ongoing court case over Netanyahu's fate in terms of his trial for corruption, which is still scheduled for next month. And Israeli courts have yet to decide on whether he can continue to lead government while he's under active indictment. So there's, and I believe the coalition deal that was announced contains a provision that Netanyahu would not be able to serve if that was the case, and new elections would need to be held. But more broadly, yes, the emergency government deal was seemed to be a really craven attempt by Netanyahu to desperately hold on to power. And I think a lot of Israeli voters were really disappointed in Gantz, given that his whole election campaign throughout all of these back-to-back elections that were held in Israel was predicated on the notion that Netanyahu was unfit to serve. And Gantz's decision to backtrack on that resulted in the fragmentation of his coalition. And he himself has admitted that it was an extremely unpopular decision, but he claims it was necessary for the coronavirus response. I don't know if Israeli voters really buy that, but yes, this was a really jaw-dropping development in Israel.
In addition to the logic behind his candidacy in the three elections, he betrayed his electoral promise that he would never serve under Netanyahu or under a prime minister who was indicted. As unpopular as his decision is, I wonder whether holding a fourth election would have been less popular. There seems to be at least some relief that won't happen. But it's a completely surprising development. It seems like Gantz just lost his nerve right at the final moment of truth, essentially. There was no guarantee that he would do any better in a fourth election, but one guarantee is that he will never do as well moving forward because his party was more a coalition with other prominent opponents of Netanyahu. It's hard to even call them opposition figures because in a lot of ways their program was simply Likud without Netanyahu. There wasn't that much difference in terms of the core issues involved. As you mentioned, blue and white has split, and Gantz can never hope to do as well as he has in the past. And so in a sense, he committed political suicide under the idea that Netanyahu will give up power in 18 months to share the prime ministership. It's just a mind-boggling outcome. I've talked about this topic with Freddie a number of times on the podcast, and each time we said, it seems like this is the end of the line for Netanyahu at the same time that it's impossible to count him out. And in fact, he managed to once again avoid his own political execution, whereas Gantz seems to have committed political suicide. There was something anti-democratic about both of those things, this idea of forming a government to avoid new elections as well as betraying electoral promises. But Prachi, we've been seeing this tension between the coronavirus pandemic and the elections angle of electoral democracies, the actual mechanics of elections. You wrote a piece about this for the site on Monday. Israel's election, its last election, was among the first to be held, at least with the pandemic in the background. It wasn't yet a pandemic at the time. France subsequently held the first round of its municipal elections after its lockdown had already been declared, and there was such a poor reception of that that it then suspended the second round. And what you mentioned in your piece, you looked at some of the tensions in the United States with regard to various states and how they have responded to these challenges. And what do you see as the broad issues and challenges for elections in general with the pandemic in the context of the pandemic?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the coronavirus has really changed the electoral calendar for the next year. International IDEA has been tracking changes in the calendar, and the latest update said that 51 countries and territories across the globe have decided to postpone elections due to COVID, and 18 have decided to move forward with them as they are. So I think there are a number of challenges. In speaking about the political changes in Israel, you can see that the coronavirus could be used as an excuse or a reason to reduce political competition between candidates. I was thinking about this when Bernie Sanders decided to drop out of the U.S. Democratic primary because he was facing pressure from Democratic politicians or Democratic supporters saying, if you don't have a real path to victory, then you should just drop out so people don't have to go to the polls, which is, of course, it's a good point, but at the same time, it reduces electoral competition. And I think as we see preparations made for elections in different parts of the world, we'll notice that tension that nobody wants voters to have to choose between their health and their right to vote. At the same time, pushing forward with elections creates challenges for campaigns, especially for smaller parties and candidates who really need to mobilize and get out the vote in order to have a chance to compete.
It's a great point. I know I've really focused on the mechanics of elections and the tensions between having people come out to vote and the need for social distancing. But there's also the politics of it and this pressure in all major crises to reduce political divisions, to reduce political tensions. We haven't yet seen that in the U.S., but this idea of rallying around the flag, governments of national unity and emergency governments, that essentially reduces the offer to voters on what they can vote for. And so in addition to the mechanical tensions, there's this pressure on the political offer as well to reduce tensions and thereby reduce choice.
I definitely agree. I think that what we're seeing is in different countries, politicians trying to use the coronavirus as a reason to pass through different kinds of emergency laws. And in this case, I don't think the reduction in competition or the difficulties in holding an election in these circumstances should be a reason to just not have democracy anymore. I think it's basically a challenge that we need to meet to figure out how to have democracy in these circumstances. And speaking of Israel, there was a protest recently against the decision of Netanyahu and Gantz to partner, which provided an interesting view into what protest could look like in these circumstances. So basically, organizers marked off 2,800 spots in a park with X's so that protesters could stand 6 feet apart. And reportedly twice as many people actually showed up. And the photos are really remarkable. And I think it could show how organizing and protest in these essential parts of democracy can continue. At the same time, it definitely made me wonder, how did the protesters get there? Were they taking public transit? Were they taking cabs? Were these measures enough to prevent the coronavirus from spreading? So there are definitely things to be worked out, but I think we need to meet that challenge.
Elliot, it seems like the poster child of bad elections was the election in Wisconsin a couple weeks ago, where there was partisan disputes between the Republican and Democratic leadership of the state. The Republicans insisted on holding the election. Through a calculation, it seems relatively clear that a suppressed turnout would benefit them, and in a particular key race, it didn't end up happening or working out that way for them. But there was a lot of criticism about the push to keep the election, to maintain the election. It seems like that contrasts dramatically with South Korea, which also recently held its parliamentary elections, but really managed, in addition to its initial response to the pandemic, managed to conduct the actual mechanics of the election in a much more effective way.
The contrast between South Korea and Wisconsin was certainly a really, really stark one. But one thing that I thought was interesting to note the similarity between the two cases was that you saw very high turnout in both situations, right? South Korea had the highest turnout of any election since its transition to democracy in the late 80s. And in Wisconsin, despite the efforts you mentioned by Republicans and the conservative-led Supreme Court to suppress turnout, you had thousands of people turn out to vote on a level that usually isn't seen for an election of this nature, a primary election. That said, yes, there were plenty of things that Wisconsin could and should have done differently, and I'm hoping that the South Korean election will turn out to be more of the model that a lot of democracies choose to follow going forward. The comparison is also really stark between South Korea and Israel, right, where Prime Minister Netanyahu has used emergency powers to try to shut down the Israeli court system, to try to remove the Knesset speaker, to shut down the legislature, to try to prevent a new speaker from being formed and conduct oversight over his government. Those were all before the current emergency government was formed, but they showed the danger of these kinds of emergency powers that are enacted during a public health crisis and how they could be used anti-democratically as well. Fortunately, we have the example of President Moon Jae-in in South Korea, who showed really strong leadership and held elections on schedule and took a lot of very necessary precautions to ensure that public health was preserved while people exercised their rights to vote.
One of the things that I've read, and also that my initial reaction when the impact of the pandemic began to become clearer, that I remember thinking that one of the keys to governments being able to maintain public buy-in, especially in electoral democracies, will be this question of legitimacy, this question of trust. We've seen that repeated over and over. And yet South Korea, which is always mentioned as one of the, along with Taiwan, initially Singapore and Germany, as one of the countries that had the most proactive and effective initial response to the pandemic. At the same time, when you look at South Korean politics over the past 3 to 5 years, there was a major corruption scandal that led to the impeachment of the previous president, a very divided political landscape. There was in 2015, I believe, what was considered a failed response to the MERS pandemic. And so it seems like a stretch at the very least to consider South Korea as meeting any of those conditions, whether it's a huge trust in government or a unified or solid or nonpartisan political landscape. And yet Moon's party won a decisive majority. And it seems that it was largely on the back of this effective response to the pandemic that became the central factor in the election outcome. Is that a correct reading, or am I missing something?
No, I think you're right. I think one of the consistent themes we see in countries that have responded well to the coronavirus pandemic is that they learn from previous disasters, right? So you mentioned the MERS outbreak in South Korea, but there was also, during the administration of Moon's predecessor, Park Geun-hye, a ferry that collapsed with hundreds of high school students, and more than 300 of them died. It was a tremendously traumatic episode in South Korea. And President Park at the time was criticized for her kind of distant, kind of aloof response. And I think President Moon really learned from that and made sure to show a very hands-on approach, right? Really being front and center, leading during this crisis, appearing in front of the public with his mask on and talking about how strong and very difficult measures would need to be taken. We saw the same thing in Taiwan, as you mentioned, where the government really learned from the SARS outbreak in 2002 and 2003, which killed dozens of people in Taiwan, and structured their response so as to avoid the mistakes that were made then.
Prachi, do you think that as we move forward, if the mechanical challenges of maintaining elections are overcome, that we'll see the pandemic response become central to electoral politics? There's this issue of a collapsing of what's on political offer, but we're seeing the first emergence in Great Britain, in France, of real vocal criticisms of the initial government responses, for instance, and the beginnings of parliamentary oversight and calls for investigative commissions and things like that. I imagine in the U.S. that once this initial phase of the crisis is behind us, that the Democratic House will probably become more active with regard to that as well. But do you see that becoming the central issue in electoral politics over the course of the next 6 months to a year, say, or once the crisis is behind us, will it fade and will other issues that were more prominent previously return to the forefront?
Well, I think that the coronavirus pandemic and responses to it will definitely be a big election issue. Democracies, as we noted in the first phase of the pandemic, were pretty slow to respond. And that's actually a feature of democracies that, in democracies, everything is a crisis, and it makes it kind of hard to respond to a real crisis when it happens. So in the mid and long term, though, democracies are able to pivot to course correct and address some of the causes that prevented a good response in the first place. So I think in healthy democracies, we might see some of these officials who failed to respond held accountable. Whether you think, say, the United States is a healthy democracy is another question. I think that we'll probably also see some of the second-order, third-order effects of the coronavirus play a really important part. I think that the economic consequences of the pandemic and government responses to that will be probably on the forefront of everyone's mind, with unemployment skyrocketing in many different countries.
It's a great point. Also, what's on offer in terms of rescue, reconstruction, and stimulus packages, and how those are targeted among populations. I think in the U.S. too, because of the nature of the levels of government, whether between state governors and the U.S. federal government, there will be multiple levels of accountability. So I think that we'll probably see many governors either reap the benefits or pay the cost of their initial response. And obviously all eyes are on November in terms of the presidential election to see what impact this has on that race. There's also, I think you mentioned, Prachi, these the protest in Israel and the role that protest plays in electoral democracies, as well as in transitioning countries, in countries that we saw like Sudan or Algeria, where massive protest movements took place over the course of late 2019, and they ended up with changes in government in both countries. Bolivia as well is another one. And then there were these other major protest movements in Lebanon and Algeria, as well as in Chile, all of which have quieted down, obviously, for obvious reasons. Do you see that chilling factor that the pandemic has in terms of the non-election aspects of electoral democracies? Is that something that will have a permanent impact? Is it something that will have much more of an impact in some of these transitioning democracies than in established democracies, or is it something that we really need to keep an eye on across the board?
I think it's been very difficult to see what's happened to some of these protest movements that, last year analysts were calling 2019 the year of the protester, and so much of that energy has dissipated just out of necessity. And as you mentioned Chile. Chile's referendum has been postponed because of the coronavirus pandemic, and some of these transitioning democracies have had to make similar decisions. So Bolivia, for example, postponed its general election, which would have been the first election after Evo Morales left office, and they postponed it to sometime before October. I don't think that date has been set yet. Ultimately, the fate of these transitioning democracies and protests kind of depends on the goodwill of the people in the transitional governments. So in Sudan, the transitional government has a power-sharing agreement between the military and the civilian government, and the divisions there and how they're allocating different responsibilities were already really unclear. And now it seems like tensions are rising. So most recently, the prime minister of the civilian government tried to fire a general over a disagreement about social distancing measures that kind of ramped up tensions there. It seems that all parties are still committed to a good transition, so as long as that survives, then hopefully it'll be in good shape. But it really just depends. It's a very difficult time to throw a crisis like this at countries that are already fragile.
And I'll add one thought with regard to France, where we've all of throughout 2019 or late 2018 and early 2019, there was the Yellow Vest movement, which demonstrated a real massive disconnect between the government and a sort of almost invisible component of the French population. And it led to quite a few charges of police brutality in the countermeasures against the protesters. And what we've seen in France, especially in the what are called the banlieue, or the suburbs of the cities, which are not in the American sense of suburbs, but the outlying regions of the cities where there's a large minority populations, large concentration of either immigrants or children of immigrants who grew up in France, second, third generation. And there's always been a tense relationship with the police in those areas. And we've seen that sort of spark into confrontations, and this week a few small-scale riots or outbreaks of disorder. And it just it brings to my mind the fact that we've seen the impact on previously existing protest movements, but as you said, Prachi, there's going to be second order and third order impacts from the pandemic and the measures taken to fight it, and so we're certain to see grievances and discontent bubble up, and that tension on how much public protest is possible. Elliot, any thoughts on this tension between the pandemic and the non-election aspects of electoral democracy, or even the election aspects? Is democracy in both its electoral and non-electoral expressions? Is it possible that it can survive with social distancing over the long term?
Absolutely. I think that was shown very clearly in South Korea, where You had record high turnout for an election that was held in the middle of a pandemic, and the election was held safely. And I think if the conditions were the same 6 months from now and South Korea had another election, it would be a replay of the same circumstances. One thing that's interesting, I think, about South Korea, and this applies to a few other countries we've been talking about as well, is that it's a very young democracy, right? So a lot of voters still have memory of military rule and place a very high value on maintaining the right to vote and maintaining strong democratic institutions as a result. And I think that that energy is something that the U.S. has maybe somewhat lost sight of in some ways, right? You see systematic attempts at voter suppression, not just in Wisconsin, but throughout the country in a lot of states. So I would hope that more established democracies like the U.S., but also emerging democracies like Sudan can harness that some of that yearning, some of that energy from citizens to be able to exercise their democratic rights. One other point you mentioned earlier, Judah, was this idea of legitimacy and whether some of the policies that have been enacted by democratic governments whose political fortunes have risen or fell as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. I think it's going to be interesting to watch what kinds of policies these governments try to enact, especially given that their powers, whether bequeathed to themselves by emergency orders or given by voters, as in South Korea, as a result of positive coronavirus responses, it's going to be interesting to see whether policies they enact that don't have anything to do with the coronavirus response are greeted positively by voters. You could very well imagine a situation where a government that has put in place a good coronavirus response and receives approval from voters as a result tries to enact far-reaching reforms that then voters see and say, wait a second, I didn't really bargain for this. This wasn't what I voted for you on. So that's going to be an interesting point to watch as well.
It could be the political equivalent of an immunity passport. This idea of trying to pass off all sorts of policies under the approval ratings of your pandemic response, and whether or not that flies. Prachi, any last thoughts before we move on?
Just a couple small things. One is that definitely, Elliot, I think we've already seen that dynamic at play in this South Korean election, that, Moon Jae-in was elected somewhat in response to Ms. Park's corruption scandal. Some of the policies that he's enacted have not really been tested at the ballot box. And now with his successful coronavirus response, he's essentially gotten this victory again because of that, and his policies have gone untested again. For example, one of those policies is his friendly approach toward North Korea. But on the other hand, it's been interesting that this election saw the first North Korean defector to be directly elected to the country's legislature, Tae Young-ho, who is the highest-ranking North Korean defector who just defected a couple years ago. So it's interesting. In a democracy, we might see some imbalances and policies going untested, but then we can see... we can get a sense of how voters feel across the board when you look at down-ballot elections. Another thing I want to mention is Hong Kong. That's been in the news this week. Judah, when you asked about what's become of protests from last year, I think this is a quite grim case. I mean, Hong Kongers have been fighting for their democracy, and that energy hasn't necessarily gone away, but under the cover of the coronavirus, it seems that the pro-China politicians and the Chinese Communist Party itself is trying to use this as an excuse to undermine its democracy. There are a couple pieces about this on WPR today, in case anyone's interested in reading up.
I guess my final thought would be something that Prachi, you mentioned earlier, just to underline it. Oftentimes when it comes to crises of this nature, democracies can be sloppy, they can be slow to act and to mobilize, but the advantage that they have over non-democratic systems usually is that there's more ability to learn from mistakes. There's more ability to integrate feedback from the governed with regard to grievances and reception of initial reactions and responses. And then there's also the higher ability to hold accountable elected officials for their responses. So I think the balance between the optimistic and pessimistic take is that there will certainly be challenges, and there will certainly be anti-democratic trends and developments. But I think over the long run, democracies do have certain inherent advantages to bouncing back and rebounding from this kind of crisis. All right, time to flag some WPR articles for everyone listening. Elliot, which one did you have in mind?
Adam Isaacson's briefing on how the Trump administration's anti-immigrant crackdown is creating new coronavirus hotspots. Adam outlines how Trump is seizing on a public health emergency to enact strict anti-immigrant measures, and effectively shows what the Trump administration's visions for U.S. immigration policy writ large, and also at the southern border with Mexico, would look like if it were given free rein. And in the process, there are new and dangerous transmission pathways for COVID-19 that are being created in detention facilities in Mexican border towns, through deportation flights, and at construction sites for the border wall.
And Prachi, which one did you want to mention?
I wanted to mention this week's long-form piece by Christina Mani on the militarization of COVID responses across Latin America. So Mani details how Latin American militaries are stepping in to take a leading role in responding to COVID. They're doing everything from handing out food, to producing medical equipment, to sanitizing streets, to creating public health strategies. In that region, the military's involvement is not neutral. So Mani writes, thanks to COVID-19, Latin American militaries have become more important to the state and society than at any point since the dark days of Cold War-era dictatorships. Mani provides a historical background to put this new reliance on the military in context, and ultimately asks, will politicians be willing and able to roll back the militarization they are now embracing once the pandemic is over?
All right, and I'll mention a briefing by Gillian Kessler-Damour about a Canadian Indigenous people's opposition to an oil pipeline project that they say is cutting through their land without their consent. We're used to hearing about the environmental and health concerns that often drive protests against these infrastructure projects, but Gillian highlights another dramatic impact they have on Indigenous communities: sexual violence against Indigenous women, in part because of the large numbers of transient workers often housed in nearby camps. As Gillian writes, a government report published last summer called for making, quote, the safety of Indigenous women a factor at all stages of an infrastructure project's development, and urged governments and companies to outline how they intend to mitigate the risks. Yet the government's promises of action never seem to materialize, unquote. All right, two things I want to mention before we get to the Who Said That segment. First, if you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our free daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. You'll get free access to selected WPR articles all week long, as well as a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. Again, the URL is wpr.pub/trendlines. And second, if you'd like to drop us a line with questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. All right, time for Who Said That? Elliot, why don't you kick things off?
This so-called lawsuit is very absurd and has no factual and legal basis at all.
That one does not ring a bell. I might have read about it, but I'm not sure I could nail that quote. Prachi, any idea?
No, I'm not sure.
That was Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Geng Shuang commenting on a civil lawsuit brought by the state of Missouri against China over its handling of the coronavirus. The lawsuit isn't really expected to go anywhere.
The blame game for who's responsible.
Yes, absolutely.
Prachi, what do you got for us?
All right, here it goes. It was a consensual divorce because more important than me and more important than him is the health of the blank people.
Huh. I'm assuming that it's a government coalition split, or it sounds almost like Gantz, but talking about the divorce from blue and white, but it doesn't seem to make sense. Elliot, any idea?
Yeah, I would have had the same thought. Maybe Yair Lapid or one of the other blue and white leaders.
So this was actually Jair Bolsonaro talking about his decision to fire popular health minister Luis Enrique Mandetta. They had a disagreement about the importance of social isolation because Bolsonaro has dismissed the coronavirus as a little flu.
You know it's bad when you can be confused for Bolsonaro. All right, here's my quote. You probably won't get who said it, but it's more who it's said about. That's the correct answer. Here's the quote. There was a lot of media interest about him being in hospital, and to be honest, that was the toughest. As a unit, he was just another patient we were trying to do our best for, so it was business as usual. It was just another day at the office.
I'm pretty sure I know who this or what this is about, actually.
Prachi?
Well, I would guess it's about Boris Johnson.
Elliot, was that who you had in mind?
Yeah, I figured it was one of the medical professionals who was taking care of Boris Johnson while he was in the hospital.
It was Jenny McGee, who is an intensive care nurse at the hospital where Johnson spent about a week, I believe, in treatment for the coronavirus. Johnson went on to thank McGee and another intensive care nurse in his video address after his release. McGee is originally from New Zealand and the other nurse originally from Portugal, so two immigrants to the United Kingdom who were essential to saving the life of the prime minister, which is something of an irony given the role that immigration played in the Brexit campaign that Johnson supported. All right, great stuff. Thanks, Elliot.
Thanks, Judah.
Thanks, Prachi.
Thanks, Judah.
If you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected WPR articles all week long, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. And if you'd like to send comments or questions, email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter, and you can find links to pieces covering the issues we talked about in the show notes on worldpoliticsreview.com. Have a great weekend, and see you next week for 2 new episodes of Trendlines.